Okay, so we're going to start with the third endocrine video lecture. This is where we ended off before with the disorders of growth hormone. Now we're talking about anterior pituitary hormones again, prolactin, which remember stimulates milk production. We just mentioned growth hormone. It's one called melanocyte stimulating hormone, but apparently it's not active in adults except for pregnant women because it makes their areola darker. So the book says to sort of ignore it, not go through it. So, and it's only I think it's only active when you're a young child or a fetus. So just realize that MSH is produced, but we're not going to talk too much about it. Control of secretion. What controls the secretion of these things? Well, one thing is the hypothalamus. It's a big area of control because, of course, it makes the releasing hormones, right? It makes and secretes the releasing hormones that control the release of the trophic and stimulating hormones from the anterior pituitary. Cerebral control. Sometimes there's, it's not conscious cerebral control, but control from the higher areas in the, particularly the limbic system and other areas. Okay, feedback from target organs. There's going to be sometimes, like in the gonadal axis, we'll get a hormone called inhibin that's sent out that will inhibit the secretion of FSH to turn down testosterone. So target organs sometimes send out hormones to affect secretion or stop secretion. And then, of course, there's negative feedback inhibition. All of these hormones have negative feedback inhibition, where once these hormones build up, they have target cells in the hypothalamus and the interpituitary, and they turn down the secretion of the releasing hormones and the stimulating hormones to turn down their own concentration in the blood. Okay, pineal gland. This is a neuroendocrine tissue. It's a gland right in the brain. It's a brain structure. It secretes something called melatonin, and this has a role in what's called circadian rhythm. That is, your circadian means almost 24. We're really at 25 hour day, really. And we'll talk about another area that controls circadian rhythm when we talk about the brain in the hypothalamus. But anyway, and it may have a role in timing of puberty as well. And it's it affects actually how you feel. It really builds up over the course of the night, and light actually breaks it down. And as you break it down, you've got to feel better and better. So actually, a lot of it makes you not feel so good. And some people are really affected by this. And it was called, and they have what's called SAD, which is a great acronym for seasonal affective disorder. They make a lot of melatonin at night, and they're really they don't really feel good. They're really in a bad mood. They don't feel well. So and normally over the course of the day, they would feel better and better because in the summertime, for example, it's long days, lots of light, and light breaks down melatonin. So, so in the wintertime, the days are really short, there's not very much light. So they sit in front of these like glow lamps in the morning and get light therapy that helps them break down melatonin so they feel better. And it has a really interesting evolutionary history because it is a third eye. There's very primitive reptiles have a third eye right on top of their heads. And it's a light detector. It's not really, it doesn't really get images, but it just detects how much light. And it affects their reproductive system as to when they're going to be receptive for reproducing. That's why it may have some bit of effect on the timing of puberty with us. And what has happened is this light detector has been our cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex of a reptile is pretty minimal, right? And the third eye is right in the middle of those. Well, in mammals, the cerebrum has overgrown that third eye and covered it over. So now it's deep in the brain between the hemispheres. And when you do the brain dissection, you can spread the hemispheres apart and see this pineal gland. So it's really interesting evolutionary history. Okay, the thymus. This is a endocrine organ on top, right on top of the heart. And it is the site of maturation of T lymphocytes. Next semester in the immune system, we'll learn all about T lymphocytes. The T in T lymphocytes actually stands for thymus. It secretes these hormones called thymosins that really help mature these T lymphocytes, and they're responsible for what's called cell-mediated immunity. It's really large in infants. Actually, when an infant is born, their immune system is not all that great. That's why breastfeeding is good, because it gives the infant some antibodies. But after a few months, these infants and toddlers have incredible immune systems, and they have large thymuses. And that's why it's good for them to come into contact with all different kinds of bacteria and viruses. It gives them lifelong immunity because they get mild symptoms and they get lifelong immunity. Because as you grow older, the thymus gets smaller and smaller, and the immune system gets weaker and weaker as you grow older, like everything else. Okay. Thyroid gland. All right, right in your throat. It's butterfly shaped inside your throat. Secretion of thyroxine or thyroid hormone. And this is a controlled metabolism. It's called calorogenic effect because it really speeds up your metabolism. And a good example is if you go out on a really cold day, you'll be stimulating thyroxine to speed up your metabolism and create heat and keep your body warm. So you burn calories, and you burn calories to do that. That's why it's called calorogenic. Then secretion of calcitonin. This is a hormone that decreases blood calcium, active in children, not that much active in adults. And then within the thyroid are little islands of cells called the parathyroid glands. And they secrete PTH, which is parathyroid hormone, and is a completely antagonistic hormone to the one secreted by the thyroid, calcitonin, because calcitonin decreases blood calcium. PTH raises blood calcium. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the bone chapter, because it really regulates how much regulates blood calcium, and whether you break down bone to produce calcium or you build up bone to decrease blood calcium. Okay. So there's the, and remember, the thyroid gland is one of these axes that has triple hormones. Starting off with the stimulus, one or more things that stimulate decreased thyroid hormone. Other stimuli include cold weather, as I mentioned, pregnancy, and pregnancy is misspelled there, I think. High altitude and hypoglycemia. Because this is one hormone that actually raises blood glucose. We're going to find out that there's lots of hormones that raise blood glucose. Okay. Receptor to hypothalamus responds to these various stimuli. Hypothalamus releases thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, into the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. It travels to the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary releases thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. Thyroid stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid gland, which stimulates the production of thyroid hormone. thyroid hormone is put into the blood, and it goes to all the organs, to all these target cells all over the body, actually. In neurons, increased metabolic rate, increased glucose uptake, liver tissue, increased glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis. So we're breaking down glycogen, and we're possibly making glucose from amino acids. Increased lipolysis, breakdown. So it's making these molecules available to make ATP. Increased breathing rate, increased heart rate, increased force of contraction. Helps meet increased oxygen demand from higher aerobic cellular metabolism. Also, that's the thing with the high altitude also. You're not getting enough oxygen, you need to speed up your metabolism and get increased oxygen consumption. Well, increased oxygen demand for increased ATP, for making more ATP. Okay, and then increased metabolic rate supported by increased release of stored fuel molecules and increased delivery of oxygen. And then the thyroid hormone, again, with negative feedback, feedbacks upon the hypothalamus to turn off TRH, feedback about the anterior pituitary, turn off TSH. A couple of disorders of thyroxine. As usual, the disorders are too much thyroxine, too little thyroxine. Hyperthyroidism is sometimes called thyroid storm or Graves' disease. And you become really, really anxious, your metabolic rate goes up, you start sweating. Actually, many people, their eyes start to bulge because there are fat pads behind the eyes. And the thyroid hormone causes those fat pads to increase or something. Even though it stimulates lipolysis, it makes those fat pads and your eyes start to bulge. And you're really jittery. Hypothyroid, exact opposite. You're really lethargic and you get cold easily, and you're really sleepy and tired all the time. And then the special thing is what's called a goiter, or what are called an endemic goiter, because in order to make a thyroid hormone, you need iodine, the iodine ions. And that's the only nutritive need for iodine, is to make thyroid hormone. And it's a really important hormone, and you need the iodine. So if you eat a diet that has enough iodine in it, then you're fine. And this is true if you eat, there's not that many foods that have a lot of iodine in it. Seafood is one thing. So if you eat a lot of seafood, you got no problem. And now, of course, they put iodine in some salt. But in the old days in the U.S., and even in some day in Eurasia, where you're out you're really far away from the ocean, and you have iodine-poor soil, and there's very little iodine around, and so your body starts to crave iodine, and what will happen is that your thyroid gland will hypertrophy. Will grow larger and larger and larger, trying to scour every last iodine ion in your blood, right? So that's when you're really low on iodine. It happens very rarely in the U.S. now. Okay, adrenal glands. This is another dual gland. Adrenal cortex, adrenal medulla, and they make really different hormones. The medulla makes, well, I got monoamines down here. Same thing as biogenic amines. Epinephrine, norepinephrine. That's what's made in the medulla, and they are stress hormones. They help prepare you for fight or flight, and they're stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. And actually, the adrenal medulla is really like a sympathetic ganglion. It's neuroendocrine tissue. It's called anaxonic axons. antistatic neurons that don't have an axon. They don't generate action potentials. They secrete norepinephrine. So it provides you for really quick emergency stress to deal with. In the cortex, they make steroid hormones. There's three layers: the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. And they make three really different kinds of steroid hormones. Glomerulus makes aldosterone, which is called a mineralocorticoid. And what it does is it helps you retain salt and retain water. So it actually tends to increase your blood pressure. And it's stimulated by a decrease in blood pressure. And it's also stimulated by too high potassium, because you retain sodium. If you retain sodium in aldosterone, you lose potassium. And actually, potassium may be even a more important hormone, ion for this hormone to regulate, because high sodium is dangerous with high blood pressure, but high potassium has neurological consequences that are really dangerous. So it really helps to regulate sodium and potassium. Ion concentrations in your blood. It also has a big effect on blood pressure, because when you retain sodium, you retain water along with it. So your blood volume goes up and your blood pressure goes up. Cortisol, another stress hormone, but this is for like long-term, chronic stress, low-level chronic stress. And it what it does is it mobilizes. It's a little like thyroid hormone, and it doesn't raise your metabolism, but it mobilizes all your nutrient molecules to make more ATP and to prepare yourself for dealing with this stress. It also inhibits your immune system. So that's why people who are under stress are more susceptible to getting some kind of infection or disease or something, because there's a lot of cortisol if you're under this chronic stress, and it inhibits your immune system. That's why it inhibits inflammation. You've heard of cortisone shots. Well, it's like artificial cortisol, which reduces inflammation. And sometimes that's a good thing, because you get over-inflammation. It's good to reduce that. But inflammation is an important immune response that we'll get to next semester. And then finally, the zona reticularis is sex steroids. It makes the androgens and estrogens. So here's the thing with the two genders. If you're adult male, you make a lot of androgen, right? If you're adult female, you make a lot of estrogen. Because you have testes in males and ovaries in females that make a lot of these sex steroids. But you have adrenal glands that make both of them. So the source of estrogens in males is adrenal glands, and the source of testosterone or androgens in females are the adrenal glands. Okay, and this is again a axis, a triple hormone relationship, where variables that act in the hypothalamus, negative feedback by cortisol, time of day, stress, cause the hypothalamus to respond to this by secreting a CRH, corticotrophin releasing hormone, into the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. It travels to the anterior pituitary and causes the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, adrenocorticotrophic hormone. Adrenocorticotrophic hormone goes into the blood, travels to the adrenal gland, and causes the release of cortisol. Cortisol is put into the blood. What does it do? Stimulation of gluconeogenesis, making amino acids, making glucose from amino acids and then glycerol and triglycerides. So to raise blood glucose. It's another hormone that raises blood glucose. Stimulation of lipolysis, inhibition of lipogenesis. So breaking down fat to help fuel this response to stress. Stimulation of protein catabolism, occurs in all cells except hepatocytes. So breaking down some proteins, perhaps for gluconeogenesis. So high doses of cortisol increase retention of sodium and water because cortisol is similar to aldosterone. They're both steroids. As a matter of fact, remember, aldosterone is called a mineralocorticoid. Cortisol is called a glucocorticoid. And there's some overlap there. So cortisol makes you retain sodium and water also to a less extent than aldosterone, but still there's some slop there. Decrease inflammation, as I just mentioned. It reduces inflammation, suppresses the immune system, and inhibits connective tissue repair. So then when you get net effective increase of nutrients in the blood, and after you've dealt with this stress, and the cortisol feeds back upon just like the other ones, feeds back upon the hypothalamus to turn off CRH, feeds back upon the anterior pituitary to turn off ACTH. So negative feedback again. Now there's a couple of disorders of adrenal glands, again, over secretion and under secretion. Cushing's syndrome is hypersecretion of glucocorticoids. And this makes you really anxious and inhibits sexual function. It causes this buffalo hump on the back of your neck. It seems strange. Sure why this is, but you think it's supposed to break down fat, right? But it actually, behind your, on the top of your shoulders, it actually adds fat. It's people who get this buffalo hump if they have Cushing's syndrome. Addison's disease, hyposecretion. So you get pretty thin, and you get this bronzing of your skin because apparently it's similar to melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is said before is not really found in adults, but cortisol is similar to it, and it causes a browning of the skin, like you have a suntan. And a very famous person that had Addison's syndrome was JFK. Adrenogenital syndrome, this is really an unusual situation. We have a fetus that's a female and has two X's, but she's born with male genitals, except her scrotum is empty because she doesn't have testes, she has ovaries and it's still internal. And this is due to an unfortunate instance where androgens are produced by the fetal adrenal glands at precisely the wrong time, at 6 weeks of fetal development. Late next semester, we're going to talk about how you make a male and female infant. The trigger is testosterone. Either the absence of testosterone for a female or present testosterone triggers a male, or triggers male organs, male genitals. So this is also called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, the making of, it's actually, I think, oversecretion of glucocorticoids, actually. But the glucocorticoids, again, are steroids and look like androgens if they're in high doses. And so it makes this little girl born with male genitals. And they're usually surgically altered to make female genitals, and they go through life as females because they are females. However, they're going to have a male brain. That's irrevocable because of the effect of testosterone during fetal development. Okay, so the stress response. So the adrenal glands are really a stress gland, either for immediate stress, for the hormones secreted by the adrenal medulla, or long-term or lower, longer-term stress for cortisol. And this is called the stress response. So alarm response, the initial is epinephrine. And then you relax the relaxed a little bit, but you're still under, you dumped that immediate stress, but now you're still under this local long-term stress, and then you got cortisol. And after a while, if you're under stress long enough, your organs start to fail because you start to run out of the storage molecules. Storage molecule, and as cortisol, like I said, inhibits inflammation, inhibits immune response, and the organs start to fail and it'll lead to death if the stress response lasts too long. Okay, let's talk about the pancreatic islets. In the pancreas is an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. The endocrine part are these pancreatic islets, sometimes used to be called islets of Langerhans. And you have two sets of cells in there, alpha cells and beta cells. Alpha cells secrete glucagon, which raises blood glucose, and beta cells secrete insulin, which lowers blood glucose. So here's for insulin, increase in blood glucose stimulates insulin. So that's really in the absorptive phase. When you've eaten, particularly you've eaten carbohydrates, glucose goes up, stimulate. So the receptor and the control center is right in these islet cells. So they detect directly the increased glucose. They secrete insulin. What does it do? Increases glycogenesis, making glycogen, decreases glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Increase lipogenesis. So you have more glucose than you need, you're going to be making fat out of it. Increase uptake of amino acids, stimulates protein anabolism in like muscle cells. And increase of glucose by increasing glucose transport in plasma membranes of most cells. Then when the glucose goes down, then this is negative feedback that tells the beta cells, okay, stop insulin, where the blood glucose is at the normal level. Glucagon, exact opposite. Decrease in blood glucose causes glucagon to be released by the alpha cells now. They go into the blood, they do exact opposite, increase glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis, decrease glycogenesis. Increase lipolysis, decrease lipogenesis. So glucose goes back up to where it should be. This is negative feedback on the alpha cells. We can stop glucagon because we're all set. We're back to normal. And again, the receptors and control centers are right there in the islet cells. They're both the receptors and the control center. So the brain has got nothing to do with this. Even though they're doing it for the brain to maintain blood glucose. Okay, disorders. We've heard of these. Diabetes. Now, remember, you gotta be careful. There's two forms of diabetes. I should have mentioned this when we talked about ADH. If you don't have antidiuretic hormone, you don't have enough antidiuretic hormone, that's called diabetes also, but diabetes insipidus. A lack of insulin or unresponsiveness to insulin is called diabetes mellitus. Insipid means flat, mellitus means sweet, because you got really sweet blood. You also have sweet urine. And this is how before dipsticks they actually would determine this, because both people have untreated diabetes. They make voluminous urine. And the only way to figure out which it was actually taste the urine. If it's flat, it's insipid, it's lack of ADH. If it's sweet, it's diabetes mellitus. Fortunately, we have dipsticks now. We don't have to taste the urine to figure that out. Okay, there's three types of diabetes. Type 1 is an autoimmune disease. It used to be called congenital. You're born with it. You don't make insulin at all. You have no insulin, and you become insulin dependent. You have to get shots of insulin. Type 2 used to be called maturity onset diabetes because it happens later in life. And what happens is you get plenty of insulin. But for some reason, your cells have downregulated the receptors, the insulin receptors. And so insulin becomes no longer effective. And what insulin does, how it lowers blood glucose is it opens up glucose transport proteins in the cell membrane. The glucose transport protein that lets glucose in has an insulin receptor on it. If insulin is not present, it's closed. Insulin present, it's open, glucose comes inside cells, blood glucose is lowered. All right. And gestational. Pregnant women sometimes get it's called gestational diabetes because they're caring for another organism that needs lots of glucose also. So sometimes they make, like glucose get a little bit too high because they're caring for infant. And that generally goes away once parturition occurs, once the baby is born. Hypoglycemia pretty rarely happens. It happens to some people who have type 1 diabetes, for example, and inject too much insulin. Or they inject this right amount of insulin but don't eat. They become hypoglycemic. And it makes you pass out. I mean, like I said, there's neurological effects because your brain is dependent upon glucose. It has to have it. If it's too low, your brain can't function and you lose consciousness. Okay, I think we're going to call it there. And there's not too much left in the chapter, but it's still getting a little too long. So I'll cut it here. This is going to be 203endo3, I believe. And so I'll see you there'll be one more later on, so I'll see you on that one.